Hi everyone, my name is Tanya Notley. I'm a digital media researcher and producer, and in this lecture pod, I'll be talking about media cultures. Media cultures is a term or concept that's used in media and communications in two distinct ways. In the first way, media cultures is used to refer to the cultural impact of the media industries on our society, including on public opinion, tastes and values. So with this meaning, we might discuss the rise in reality TV over the past 20 years and how it's changing our understanding of privacy or of celebrity. Or we could talk about the gaming industries and how they might be changing our leisure time or our perceptions of violence. So in this way, the concern is mostly with the culture and cultural values that are embedded within the media itself. In the second understanding of this term, the focus is on the cultures that exist around media. So for example, the way anime fan cultures work, or the way social media has changed our experience of self-representation. So here the focus is on the way people develop practices around media. In this lecture, we will focus on the first understanding of media cultures only. This concept is already very broad, and it could cover the media's role in supporting capitalism, in promoting democracy, in altering social relations. And that's because public opinion, tastes and values is very broad. It can cover many, many things. In this week's lecture, which is broken up into two lecture pods, I'm going to focus on the Australian media's impact on two issues or areas. First, in this lecture pod, I will focus on the representation of women in the Australian media, and I will consider the cultural impact of this. Here I will focus particularly on the news media. In the next lecture pod, I will focus on the way ethnicity or race identity are represented in the Australian media, and again I will consider the cultural impact of this. Here I will focus on the entertainment media. So I'm going to start with women and the media, and let's start with a little flashback. The suffragette movement in the early 1900s was critical in pushing for women's right to vote. In particular, the women's movement of the 60s and 70s gave birth to feminism, a movement and a belief that men and women are equal and should be treated as such. I think it's important to be familiar with the historical context of the issues, objects, policies, or whatever you may be studying. So in that light, let's watch this short video on a critical period for the struggle for women's liberation and equality in Australia.
Women's liberation emerged as a powerful international movement in the late 60s. Australian women were at the forefront of demanding changes to their public and private lives. When Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, renounced the idea that women could only find fulfilment through child-rearing, it struck a chord.
Well, I think what men mistake for happiness was in fact resignation and patience. And now women are beginning to feel that patience is not the answer.
There was this absolutely wonderful exhilaration about breaking all the rules. It was like a great carnival. That was just immensely exciting, and so too was the sense of being part of redressing those wrongs, of changing, engaging in real social, sexual change that would make the world into a different place. That was the whole question of vision.
From 1968 on, women fought for and achieved access to abortion. They demanded equal rights in both work and domestic relationships, and financial support for single mothers.
They were the days when slogans like, you know, if men got pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament, were coined. And also, you know, we can put men on the moon, but we can't invent a safe, reliable contraceptive, cheap contraceptive. So those issues were crucial.
But not everyone agreed with the women's libers.
I'd rather be under the thumb.
No, I think I'm perfectly satisfied with us as we are.
I'm old-fashioned and he's old-fashioned, but we just believe in the same things, like I believe a woman's place is in the home.
And yet, despite this long struggle, persistent forms of gender inequality still exist today in Australia. For example, girls outperform boys at school and university in Australia, but their salaries are well below their male peers. It seems extraordinary that in 2013, a female graduate in her first year would be paid, on average, $5,000 less than a male graduate. There is simply no justifiable reason for this. Girls have on average done better in their education, and yet they come out being paid less for the same job with the same level of experience. Beyond the pay and promotion gap in Australia, we have an ongoing problem with violence against women in this country, as you can see on the screen. Australia does not fare well globally in this area. Our rates of domestic violence against women are, for example, much higher than the United States, much higher than most countries in Europe. So the question we need to ask here is, how has and how does the Australian media industry impact on women's social status, on their current position in society? The circular representation model outlined here on the screen provides a helpful starting point for discussing the socio-cultural significance of the media. Sure, to some degree, the media reflects who we are, but we also know it shapes who we are and how we see ourselves. By now in this unit, you will have been introduced to some basic communication models. You will have learnt that the transmission model, or the sender-receiver model, as it's sometimes called, has very limited value because it suggests communication is more simple than it really is. It suggests that it's one-dimensional, as though we have no control over how we receive messages from media. You know, you will have sometimes heard people say things like, "I don't like Facebook, it's making people more unsocial in real life," or "video games are making young people more violent and aggressive." These kinds of claims are often based on what we will call the hypodermic syringe model of thinking. It's based on an idea that if I give you A, then the result will always be B. The issue here is that it's easy to blame the technology, blame the media for social ills. But there are so many things that make two people receive or experience media differently. Family, their level of education, their wealth or income, their friends, their core values and beliefs. What's far more challenging to do is to try and analyse the complex relationships that are influencing how the media are shaping our worldview. But it's what we need to do. We need to critically reflect on this complexity to try and understand what is going on and what is the impact the media is having on our society, on our cultures, and vice versa. So what this model on the screen shows is a reality that is much more complex than the sender-receiver transmission model. The broader environment, which is really representing the world around us, forms an ever-changing context within which industry and media users operate. With this model, we can see that we have the media industry, the media technologies, the content, and the media users in the world around them. And relationships exist between them all. None of them are one-way linear relationships. They talk back to one another and they influence one another. So recognising this complexity, if we accept that the inequality of women in our Australian society today is unacceptable, what do? What's the role of media to change this? Do the media play a role in perpetuating and maintaining this inequality, or are they just reflecting it? These are difficult questions and also really important questions for us to ask as media and communication researchers. So to start a dialogue about these questions, let's focus now on women in the news. Investigative journalist Wendy Bacon, who is also a professor of journalism based at the Australian Centre for Independent Journalism, led a study that examined women in the media in Australia. At the time of their study in 2013, Nine Entertainment Co had one woman on its 9-member board. 7 West, which owns Channel 7, had only 1 woman on its board. Channel 10 did slightly better, with 3 out of 10 directors being women. And SBS was the only media organisation that had a board with a majority of women. 5 out of 9 members are women. In their study, Bacon and colleagues found far less women with editorial roles and less women reporting the news, doing the news gathering. It was only, surprise, surprise, presenting the news where there was something close to gender equality. So if, as their study found, we have a situation where all of the major, most popular, most read news sources in Australia have less women on their boards, less women as senior executives, less women in senior editor positions, and less women writing the news, what impact might this be having? Well, the Women in Media project asked that exact question. What is or might be the impact of the underrepresentation of women in the newsmaking process in Australia? As part of their study, what they did was to analyse all news over one average news day in Australia. They found that male sources overwhelmingly dominated the coverage, in fact by 3 to 1, and the figure was even worse in the areas of sport, business, politics and international news. The question then for us is, given that women represent half of the population in Australia, why is it that men's voices are way overrepresented in the news as sources, whether as experts or as witnesses? How can this possibly be justified or indeed explained? Well, the subordination of women in the news is not only an Australian problem, it's also a global persistent trend. This is the same study that I presented just now from Australia, carried out at a global level by researchers from many different countries. Whether it's as news subjects or reporting the news, men dominate. And the only time we see something close to equality is when it comes to presenting. We've used the term political economy in this unit a few times now, as in the political economy of the media in Australia. So I hope it's a term you're now familiar with. The political economy of the media is about who controls the media, who owns it, who runs it, and how are they connected to powerful political and economic institutions. So what we're looking at here, gender disparities in news making in Australia, is one element of the political economy of the media in Australia. But gender disparity in the Australian media is very rarely mentioned. Why? It may be because we see women in the media, and so we expect it's one area in society where we have addressed sexism and we have a more equal playing ground. Or it may be that vested interests are at play, that women or men are being punished or fear retribution for talking about these kinds of inequalities. Again, these are important questions for you and I to ask as media scholars as we examine the political economy of the media in Australia. Questions about the relationship between mass communication and gender equality have formed the basis of many books and academic papers. We've looked here at the Australian media, but you can do your own study by looking at, say, the number of female lead actors showing at your local cinema right now, by looking at how many of these films are directed or produced by women. Or you can start noticing the bylines of articles you read and counting the gender of the sources that are cited. Are women well represented? So to conclude this lecture, I want to play a short video from Dame Margaret Guilfoyle, who was a Victorian Liberal Senator between 71 and 83, and in 75 was Australia's first female Cabinet Minister. Here she talks about the way female politicians used to be portrayed in the Australian news. After watching it, I'd like you to consider if this has changed, if different terms are being used to describe the same behaviours between male and female politicians. If women politicians are today treated more harshly in the Australian news media than the men are, and if so, what the repercussions might this have on our society. You can then discuss your research and ideas in your tutorial.
Well, I made sure they didn't ever take my photo with a broom. I made sure that that didn't occur. I also tried to present myself as someone who was doing a particular job in a political career. Those women who found their way to the Parliament in more recent years haven't had the support of the community as a whole in the way that I think women in the future will have it. I think you had to be the exceptional woman. You were the always contrasted with your male colleagues. A woman would be called strident, whereas a man would be called strong. A woman would be called hysterical, whereas a man might be called compassionate. Those sorts of contrasts were always made.
In summing up, what we've seen from this lecture is that women are poorly represented at all levels of news production in Australia, other than in news presenting. And this is a persistent global trend. How does this affect the news we consume? Well, we know it affects the news stories we receive, who appears in the news. The question for you as media scholars, this question for all of us as Australian citizens is, what does this mean? And what are the consequences of this on our culture and on our society? Please think about this and do some research of your own, ready for this week's tutorial.